Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I met a young man I was mentoring. He was about 15 years old, and it was a snooker hall that I'd actually hired in this area. Upstairs is where this young fella and his friends, they were all glued to his phone, and it was a download of a British contractor called Ken Bigley. He was, as you know, innocent, and he was murdered, he was beheaded. And they were all laughing at it, and I pulled him aside and said, look, this man is innocent. He's not done you any harm. And his response was one that really got me moved and really kind of motivated me to do the work that I started doing. And he said, look, Jahan, if you think that Britain will ever accept us, you're wrong. He said, I'm the wrong color, I'm the wrong race, I'm the wrong religion. So don't even go down there and try and convince me that I'll be British, because the British people dislike us. And it touched a few chords with me, and I thought, you know, there must be a narrative that connects our community to this nation. There has to be something. The First World War, they brought Britain directly into the war. Within a short time, a battle line was drawn between Allied and German armies across Belgium and France. It became known as the Western Front. Britain sustains heavy losses. Unable to cope with the German assault, the Indian soldiers are the first non-British troops to arrive. They're fed piecemeal between Labas and Ypres, and it is here that the 129th Baloch, an infantry regiment, is rushed in. And they are made up of predominantly Muslim sepoys from the frontier, Pakistan-administered frontier, and Pakistan-administered Punjab. The first Indian to receive the Victoria Cross, which is Britain's highest military decoration for valor on the battlefield in the face of the enemy, is someone who belongs to the 129th Baloch. Now, I can't talk much about World War I or II, but I can certainly try and trim it down for you. In terms of casualties, anywhere between 62 to 64,000 fatalities, that is. In terms of injuries, over 100,000. But India's material and financial contributions are just as impressive. £80 million worth of military stores and equipment, 5 million tons of wheat valued at over £40 million sent to Great Britain, and much more to that. But the government of India pays for all its troops overseas, adding about £20 million annually to its wartime military expenditure. And before the war is ended, the Viceroy presented a gift of £100 million of imperial tax to Britain. And then they asked us what we did for Britain. But there was one particular ethnic group that was the backbone of the British Indian Army. It was the Punjabi Muslims. And these fellows would once again make that contribution known in World War II. So now let's move on to the Second World War. Germany eventually invades France, and over a period of 6 years, 2.5 million men volunteer for the British Indian Army. Just under a third are Muslim. These are the men, once again, from the Punjab region, all Muslim soldiers, who were dispatched as part of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, to France, and they were then held back in Dunkirk. 4 mule companies left. That's 1,400 men in total, of which around 800 were Muslim. But quickly moving on, 3 major battle arenas for the British Indian Army. North Africa. The North African Peninsula is paramount to Britain's war, and a month before the outbreak of war, Indians are deployed to North Africa to defend the Suez Canal in Egypt from Mussolini's troops stationed in Libya. And the 4th Indian Division emerges Britain's best infantry division. That's not me saying that. That's the Commander-in-Chief of the British Forces there, General Montgomery, states that. On that particular day of 11 May 1943, 275,000 Italian and German troops surrender. And there's a wonderful letter written by Harold Alexander to the Prime Minister, Churchill. He says, "Sir, it is my duty to report the Tunisian campaign is over. All enemy resistance has ceased. We are masters of the North African shores." And indeed, the Indians have played a pivotal role in that battle. From my study, 122 boys under the age of 17 fell in Italy. 90 were Muslim. Each one of them, bar one, were from cities now in Pakistan. The major areas were Attock, 15, Kohat, 21, and then Rawalpindi, which is obviously Punjab again at 23. And it really does make you think, or perhaps question, why so many young men? Well, between 1940 and 1942, there was a dip in enlistment amongst the Sikh and the Hindu community, for which reason Britain was now ever reliant, or even more reliant, on the Punjabi Muslims and the men of the frontier. And this is why they came to help out. This is why they fought. After World War II and partition, Pakistan itself takes in or absorbs a disproportionately large aspect of the British Indian Army, for which reason it seems to default to military rule, whereas India absorbs the Indian civil service and a disproportionately large aspect of the Indian civil service, for which reason it seems to always function best as a political administration, has not really had a military ruler or junta in that case. But it really comes back to what I said to this young man at the end of it. So I sat him down and I said, do you know anything about what we did for Britain? And he said, no, we didn't do anything for Britain. I said, look, let me tell you something. I'm not here to promote colonialism. I said, we fought for British democracy when we were denied democracy. I said, we fought as volunteers when Britain had imposed conscription on its own people. I said, we had built this country from afar and sent our young boys to fight for it when we had not seen this land. Who could possibly ask you, who could question you being in this country and that you don't deserve to be here? And he turned around and he said, it is my country. That's exactly what he said to me. He couldn't believe it. He was naturally in shock. I also explained to him that, look, I know you feel quite antagonized by Britain and the foreign policy, but you're not alone. There are many British people who were part of that first protest against the invasion of Iraq. What about them? Do you not understand that? And also, soldiers don't choose battle arenas. They're just sent where the government thinks there is a need, they send them. So they've been misled as well as you. So that's partly my story of bringing about change. But one particular message really for everyone is that, often we hear a very negative image in the news about Pakistanis. And a small fringe group of our communities hijacked the rest of us. The majority is silenced. But, we have no issues with the British public. We are very, very disappointed that some members of our community seem to think that the members of the British public are legitimate as a target. And we are very remorseful and very sorry for that. But some of them do not wish to listen to what we've got to say. And people like myself and others in our community are trying our utmost to try and change some of their thoughts.
The Pakistani diaspora is playing an important role, could play and should play an even more important role. I was very much sensitized to the potentially key role of diasporas by my experience as a journalist in the former Soviet Union in countries which achieved their independence in the early 1990s. If you look at the Baltic states where I was stationed, Armenia, some other places, and of course the countries of Eastern Europe, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, people who returned to those countries from the diaspora, partly in Britain, much more importantly, of course, in North America, played an absolutely critical role in building up democratic institutions, democratic attitudes, educational institutions in those countries. Now, as I've said, the Pakistani diaspora in this country is doing a great deal to help, as of course we all here know, in the area of flood relief in the past couple of years, through strengthening aspects of civil society, through charities, including educational charities. It has hampered, however, this effectiveness of the diaspora in Pakistan, it seems to me, by three factors. The first does not really relate to the discussion this evening. It is, well, shall we say, the nature of the Pakistani political elites. The other two factors, however, do go to the heart of what we're talking about this evening. The first is, of course, relative alienation from and distrust of the British state and government, particularly, of course, when it comes to British foreign policy and British efforts associated with British foreign policy, like DFID, International Development, which is, after all, now formally under the Foreign Office. Now, how can one bring together people who, for very good reasons, have had excellent reasons to oppose and distrust many aspects of British foreign policy and security policy in recent years? The first, I entirely agree, I mean, especially as a descendant on my mother's side of British Indian officers, with Jahan in emphasising past and extremely distinguished military service. One of the key things that people from outside, and above all, naturally, Pakistanis outside, need to contribute to Pakistan is a strengthening of democratic institutions within Pakistan. And not just of democratic institutions, but once again of a democratic mentality which underpins them. And that this democratic deficit in turn contributes to appalling problems of government and public service and public services in Pakistan. So, an emphasis on on loyalty to British democratic institutions, the British democratic system, and through that, in turn, to strengthening democracy elsewhere, first and foremost in Pakistan, irrespective of what may be the specific failures, or I would say crimes, in many ways, of recent British foreign and security policy. The other problem is that, once again, it's not just a question of British democratic institutions, but also the values that underpin them. Now, if there is one thing that is holding Pakistan back from progress and endangering, yes, even its existence in the very long run, it is first of all lack of education. And that includes not just the failings of the state and the political system, which are, yes, manifest, but also, I have to say, indifference of too much of the relative indifference of too much of the population to this as an issue. If the diaspora in this country is to play a really important part in helping Pakistan in this regard, then I have to say, once again speaking as a great sympathizer with Pakistan, that a good deal of work needs to be done here within Britain as well. If it's a question of trying to help Pakistan, then that is a question not just of helping Pakistani democratic institutions and believing in democratic institutions as they exist in Britain. It also requires a commitment to those values which underpin British democratic institutions.
As Britishborn Pakistanis, we've gone through various transitions. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, many of us saw ourselves probably more identified ourselves as black and identified with the anti-racist struggle. Pakistanis and Indians were largely sort of seen as Asian, weren't really sort of divined really in terms of religion or in terms of their different countries of origin. But in the late 80s, we saw the publication of the Satanic Verses, and Rushdie's book, which was largely seen as blasphemous by many Muslims, sparked controversy across the world. There were violent clashes in Pakistan and India and in the UK. A campaign to get the book banned was seen as a turning point that propelled the British Muslim community into the spotlight. I suppose it politicised the British Muslim community and showed them as an increasingly self-conscious. And this was further heightened by events in the 90s like the First Gulf War and the war in Bosnia. And then, of course, came 9/11, and Pakistan became a frontline state in the so-called war on terror. I think these events really resonated with the British Pakistani community. And suddenly, you know, we heard about British-born Pakistanis who were prepared to blow themselves up in the name of Islam. But then over the years, we've seen the intense media coverage of Pakistan, with over 30,000 civilians being killed in violent clashes in the war on terror across the country, with the increased instability. And just by the Pakistani Diaspora's association with the country has itself resonated within the community. And I think what we felt, that the British Pakistani community had to respond to these not only external events, but also to the internal issues that we were being faced with in this country. And I think we felt that although the terror acts supposedly carried out in the name of Islam were carried out by a minority, which was being said by many people that this in no way should, in terms, define the wider community, or that the wider Muslim community should be blamed for these attacks. But at the same time, it appeared that there was a growing sense that British Pakistanis were dangerous and that the religion of Islam posed a real threat and challenge to the West. These issues should not be seen predominantly as cultural civilizationals, despite whatever the tensions that were taking place between Pakistan and the West, that these ideas in themselves should not be seen as being something that was cultural.
As we can see from the previous speeches, any conversation on the state of the British Pakistani diaspora cannot escape Pakistan. Now, we have been not only informed that subliminally that Pakistan is somehow a hostile, malevolent force, but furthermore, it's a failed state on the verge of failing. But when we look at the economic statistics propelling Pakistan at the moment, we find that surprisingly, Pakistan and its neighborhood does very well. In Pakistan, particularly as a country that ultimately has been carved from British India, we cannot escape comparisons with India, particularly when Pakistani foreign policy has been driven and defined by India. Yet, time and time again, we have been fed the subliminal message, particularly in the last 10 years, failing Pakistan, shining India. This, on the other hand, has fed and looped back into the British Pakistani community as a way of somehow we are the ambassadors, or we are the legacy of an increasingly failed state that is on the verge of collapse, ethnic fragmentation, and a repeat of 1971. Nevertheless, on a lot of statistics, Pakistan doesn't do too badly. For instance, in its South Asia neighborhood, Pakistanis have the highest secondary education completion rates. Yet, in some cases, the British Pakistani diaspora and the worldwide diaspora seems to think of Pakistan as a basket case. We don't look at investment opportunities in Pakistan. We seem to think of it as a philanthropic institution. What I would suggest is that while we should never obscure the many issues, which I can go on at length about, what Rubia and I are very keen on, particularly there are a few members of the PIPA audience here as well, is reshaping the narrative, veering away from the catastrophic failures that we are constantly confronted by. And if anybody is involved with diaspora politics and diaspora functions, you will notice there is a charity fatigue. People seem to perceive Pakistan as a sinking ship, and there's a hopelessness which frankly isn't merited by the facts. Pakistanis are better fed than many of their South Asian counterparts. They complete education more than their South Asian counterparts. In our neighborhood of South Asia, and as an inheritor of the British Raj and British India, Pakistan has been able to live up to its legacy. We should stop looking at the glass as half empty and perhaps start looking at the glass as half full.
This issue is really about identity. The radicalized boy in my novel, The Butterfly Hunter, feels alienated. In his words, I'm not British and I'm not a Paki either. His sister says to him, well, of course you're British. You were born here, Jimmy. And he says, no, I ain't. They hate you no matter what you are because you're brown. And that's the alienation. That's the lack of identity. Throughout my life, I was told the same thing. I couldn't read, I couldn't do this, couldn't pass the 11+, couldn't be a doctor, I'll never get a mainstream book published by a mainstream British publisher, and so on and so forth. Luckily, I was fortunate enough not only to get the book published, but to actually win the British Writers' Awards published novel 2011. That's not a simple boast. The thing is, it's been a long road. But even though I was a mainstream successful Brit-Pac, I didn't feel that I belonged. And that alienation could have led down a potentially dangerous route until I realized that enlightenment is the only thing that will ever build a real civilization. I am proud of my heritage, but I think there needs to be a dialogue at two levels. And one is from the British Pakistani or Pakistani point of view to the external world, the West, if you like, to say, stop attacking Muslim countries. This will never achieve a peaceful world, and importantly, it will never achieve security for Britain. No one, and no one except the Pakistanis, will stop extremism, radicalization from within Pakistan. No one, and no one except the Muslims, will stop radicalization, extremism within their own communities. Nobody, drone attacks will never stop radicalization. Never, ever. That's an absolute fact. Everything else is up for debate. Attacking and killing and wars will not stop radicalization. Quite the converse. It is time for the demonization to stop, I think, and that's the external dialogue. If you demonize a people, you can do anything to them, as Hitler showed us. It's time for a ceasefire. I don't believe, though, it is a case you're either with us or against us, as George W. Bush said. I think there is a third way, and that's a way of mutual respect and dialogue. the East and West have long contributed to each other. There is no one without the other. Nobody sprang out of nothing. We all came from something. Pakistan, or whatever country you like to call it, from the beginning of time, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, 5,000 years ago had a civilization. It does have a civilization today. And there's no escape from that fact. And when we accept this essential truth, the essential humanity, then we'll build a just and cohesive society. And I would like to say, it's time that Pakistan took its place, but British Pakistanis and all around the world must again prove that we are indeed a civilizational force.